History often presents a carefully polished picture of the past. Schoolbooks and popular media frequently highlight the glittering accomplishments of the Islamic Golden Age, its breakthroughs in science, mathematics, literature, and architecture. We hear about the advances in algebra, the preservation of Greek philosophy, and the breathtaking beauty of cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Istanbul. Yet this shining narrative often conceals a far darker story, one that is rarely given equal attention. Behind the brilliance of scholars and the elegance of mosques stood millions of silenced voices, people who paid the price for refusing to convert, for belonging to the wrong faith, or simply for being born into conquered lands. What history books tend to glorify in one hand, they often obscure with the other, and what is hidden is just as crucial to understanding the true legacy of these empires. What you are about to hear does not come solely from hostile chroniclers or enemies of the Islamic world. Much of it comes from Muslim historians themselves, men who faithfully recorded the policies of their rulers. Their words, written centuries ago, tell a story that makes the brutalities of medieval Europe look almost restrained by comparison. The expansion of the caliphates was not only about military victories, it was about reshaping societies at their very core. This was conquest with a long memory and a long reach, designed not merely to occupy land, but to erase identities, sever families, and transform entire civilizations into shadows of what they once were. Among the most chilling examples of this system was the Ottoman practice known as the devshirme, or blood tax. To describe it simply as a levy would be misleading. In reality, it was one of the largest and most organized child extraction operations in recorded history. Beginning in the 14th century, Christian families in the Balkans lived under the constant dread of losing their sons to the Sultan's officials. Every few years, mounted men swept through villages, selecting boys between the ages of 8 and 18. The criteria were cold and exact: strength, intelligence, and physical promise. Parents stood powerless as their children were taken, often clutching them in desperation, knowing that resistance would not just fail, but invite execution for the entire household. Imagine the scene: a mother screaming as soldiers pry her son from her arms, a father restrained while his child is dragged into the street. Once chosen, the boys were marched away, never to return home. They were carried to Istanbul, where their past lives were systematically stripped away. Conversion to Islam was not an option but a command. Their Christian names were erased, replaced with new Islamic identities. Speaking their native languages was forbidden. Letters from family were impossible. Faith, kinship, and memory, all the threads that weave a human life together, were cut and replaced with the fabric of loyalty to the Ottoman state. The most gifted among these children were molded into the empire's elite soldiers, the Janissaries. These were not just warriors but a political force, directly tied to the Sultan. Their training was intense, their indoctrination thorough. Through psychological manipulation, the boys were taught that their families had abandoned them, that their Christian roots were a burden, and that the Ottoman ruler had rescued them from backwardness. The conditioning was so effective that many came to believe it wholeheartedly, dedicating their lives to the very system that had enslaved them. It was a cruel paradox. Children stolen from Christian homes became the blade used to cut down Christian resistance, ensuring that conquest fed upon itself in an endless cycle. The numbers were staggering. Between the mid-14th century and the abolition of the devshirme in the early 19th century, historians estimate that between 500,000 to 1 million boys were taken. That figure represents not just individuals but entire communities reshaped by absence. Whole regions lived in a state of generational trauma, where every knock on the door carried the fear that it might be the last moment a family saw its sons. To call this a tax is to understate the reality. It was an attack on the very survival of a people, a method of conquest that extended beyond the battlefield into the intimate heart of family life. The horror of the devshirme was not limited to the boys themselves. The very act of removing children struck a blow at community resilience. The brightest and strongest, those most capable of leading, defending, or carrying traditions forward, were deliberately removed. Resistance became nearly impossible when one's own children, converted and trained, marched at the front of the conquering army. Parents, desperate to protect their sons, resorted to heartbreaking measures. Some would disfigure their children, injuring them to make them undesirable to recruiters. Others hid them in forests or remote mountain villages during the collection seasons. Yet the Ottoman system was relentless. Once a child was marked for selection, escape was nearly impossible. If the devshirme revealed the empire's ruthlessness in reshaping conquered peoples, the broader Islamic slave trade revealed an even deeper cruelty. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which lasted roughly 4 centuries, the Islamic slave trade stretched over 1,400 years, from the 7th century into the dawn of the 20th. Conservative estimates suggest that between 11 and 17 million Africans were enslaved and transported to Islamic lands, but many historians suspect the true figure was far higher. What set this system apart was not only its longevity, but its methods. A particularly horrifying feature was the widespread use of castration. Unlike the plantation systems of the Americas, which relied on enslaved populations reproducing to sustain themselves, the Islamic slave trade often sought to prevent reproduction altogether. Between 80 and 90% of enslaved males were subjected to castration, either before transportation or upon arrival in markets across North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The procedure itself was lethal. With little understanding of antiseptic methods and primitive surgical techniques, the survival rate was abysmally low. 9 out of 10 boys and men subjected to the operation did not survive. In other words, the trade was not only one of enslavement, but of mass extermination by neglect and cruelty. Those who survived became eunuchs, forever marked as less than whole, deprived of family life, reproduction, and dignity. Castration was not incidental, it was deliberate policy. Eunuchs were seen as safer guardians of harems, trusted servants in households, and more manageable slaves because their ability to pass on their lineage had been destroyed. The industrial scale of the practice is almost unimaginable. The castration centers in Aswan, Egypt, alone processed thousands annually. Survivors lived as shadows of men, their mutilation ensuring that they were reminders of dominance rather than threats to it. The result was catastrophic for African societies. Generations of men were stolen, mutilated, and erased, leaving demographic scars that are still visible today. Unlike the Atlantic trade, which inadvertently created large populations of African descent in the Americas, the Islamic trade destroyed entire bloodlines. The policy ensured that millions were not only lost to slavery but prevented from leaving descendants, making the true, it all impossible to measure. This dual system, the devshirme in Europe and the slave trade in Africa, shows the calculated brutality of Islamic imperial policy. It was not conquest for land alone, but conquest for control of human beings at the most intimate level. By seizing children, breaking families, and extinguishing bloodlines, these empires perfected a form of dominance that reached far deeper than the sword. They waged war not only on armies but on memory, culture, and hope itself. What remains today are fragments, villages in the Balkans where stories of the blood tax linger like inherited nightmares, or African regions where demographic imbalances trace back to centuries of raids and castration. And yet, much of this history remains obscured beneath the glittering narrative of a golden age. To remember only the beauty of the architecture and the brilliance of the mathematics is to tell only half the story. The other half lies in the silence of the boys who never returned home, the eunuchs who lived lives of mutilated servitude, and the families who endured centuries of fear and loss. Islamic law openly permitted slavery, though it often framed the practice as a regulated institution with moral guidelines. Religious texts encouraged the freeing of slaves, particularly those who converted to Islam, presenting manumission as a virtuous act. Yet the reality of the system was far less benevolent. While some individuals were released and integrated into Muslim society, the structure of slavery in the Islamic world ensured that demand for new captives never ceased. By discouraging reproduction among slaves, whether through castration, concubinage, or deliberate policies, these societies created a permanent dependency on conquest, raids, and human trafficking. It was not an accident, but a calculated strategy, one that avoided the complications of managing a large, multi-generational enslaved population, while guaranteeing a steady influx of new bodies. The fate of women in this system was especially grim. The most beautiful and youthful among them were chosen for harems, destined for lives as concubines in royal courts or wealthy households. Their value lay in appearance and obedience, and once they lost either, they were often discarded, sold, or pushed into harsher forms of labour. Those deemed less attractive were put to work as domestic servants, performing endless tasks under strict control. Unlike in the Americas, where enslaved men and women often lived together and formed families that could survive and multiply despite hardship, Islamic slavery was structured to prevent the development of enduring slave communities. It was a system designed to sever continuity, to make sure that the enslaved remained transient, replaceable, and unable to create bonds strong enough to resist. One of the most infamous embodiments of this logic was the Mamluk system. Young boys, often from the Caucasus and Central Asia, were purchased in staggering numbers. They were brought into Islamic lands as slaves, forcibly converted, and rigorously trained to serve as elite soldiers. The process mirrored the Ottoman devshirme, but on an even broader and more militarized scale. Over time, the Mamluks grew so powerful that they overthrew their own masters, establishing themselves as rulers of Egypt and Syria. For over 2.5 centuries, they controlled some of the most important territories in the Islamic world. Yet even as they sat on thrones, they maintained the very system that had once enslaved them. Their sons were not allowed to inherit their positions. Instead, new slaves were continuously imported, ensuring that loyalty was always to the institution, not to family or lineage. It was a state built on the perpetual recycling of bondage, a kingdom that thrived by denying its rulers the basic continuity of bloodlines. The toll on the source regions was catastrophic. Entire swaths of Africa, the Caucasus and Central Asia were depopulated by relentless raids and slave hunts. Communities lived in constant fear of capture, and warfare became a never-ending cycle fueled by the demand for human cargo. Local economies collapsed under the strain. Agricultural lands were abandoned, trade routes disrupted, and societies that might have flourished under different conditions instead became trapped in stagnation. In many cases, the damage was irreversible. Villages disappeared, cultures eroded, and generations of potential leaders and builders were drained away to feed distant markets. Some areas never recovered from the centuries of systematic human trafficking, their development permanently crippled by the loss of people. What is perhaps most disturbing is the casual way in which these practices were described by contemporary chroniclers. Arab historians such as al-Tabari or Ibn Battuta often wrote matter-of-factly about bustling slave markets, raids, and even castration centres. Their tone was clinical, as though recording grain harvests or tax receipts. They detailed how captives were processed, sold, or mutilated without any sense that such practices were extraordinary or cruel. To them, these operations were not shocking, they were routine features of economic life. This normalization reveals just how deeply embedded slavery and human destruction were in the foundations of the empire. But the story does not end with slavery alone. Alongside the physical dismantling of populations came a sophisticated framework for dismantling religions. Islamic Caliphates became adept at creating systems that eroded competing faiths while maintaining the illusion that conversions were voluntary. The dhimmi system, for instance, gave Christians and Jews legal recognition as people of the book. But this recognition came at a crushing cost. Non-Muslims were subjected to the jizya, a special poll tax that was deliberately calibrated to impoverish them. In many regions, the tax equaled several months of income, a burden nearly impossible for ordinary families to carry. The process of paying this tax was intentionally humiliating. Dhimmis were often required to present themselves publicly, kneel before officials, and sometimes even endure blows during the transaction. It was a ritual of degradation, a reminder of subordination dressed in the form of legal obligation. Over time, the weight of the tax pushed many families to the breaking point. Conversion to Islam became not so much a spiritual decision as a financial necessity. The system allowed rulers to claim that conversions were voluntary, while in reality, economic survival left little choice. Taxation, however, was only one element of a broader campaign. The destruction of religious infrastructure was equally central to the strategy. When Arab armies swept into Egypt in 641 AD, they did not merely conquer territory, they initiated a centuries-long process of erasing Coptic Christian culture. Monasteries and churches, which had served not only as centres of worship, but also as repositories of ancient knowledge, were systematically demolished. These buildings often held the last surviving manuscripts of pre-Islamic Egypt, treasures of philosophy, medicine, and theology. Their loss represented not just an assault on Christianity, but the deliberate extinguishing of a civilization's intellectual heritage. A similar pattern unfolded in Persia. Zoroastrianism, once the spiritual backbone of the great Persian empires, was methodically dismantled. Fire temples that had burned for over 1,000 years, considered sacred embodiments of divine continuity, were extinguished. Priests were executed or forced to convert, and sacred texts were burned in massive numbers. Within only a few generations, a religion that had dominated the region for over a millennium was reduced to a persecuted minority, clinging to survival in isolated pockets. The campaigns of Mahmud of Ghazni in India offer perhaps the most brutal illustration of this policy. Between 1000 and 1027 AD, Mahmud led repeated invasions into the Indian subcontinent, his chroniclers proudly recording his destruction of Hindu temples. They boasted of over 50,000 temples destroyed, millions forced to convert, and treasures stripped from sacred sites. The most infamous act was the demolition of the Somnath temple, one of the holiest sites in Hinduism. Its sacred fragments were carted away and used as building material for a mosque, an act of calculated humiliation. Conversions often took place in the ruins themselves, with new believers kneeling before the very stones of their shattered faith. This was not random plunder, it was deliberate psychological warfare, designed to prove that the gods of the conquered were powerless before the armies of Islam. Even in lands where Christianity and Judaism were tolerated, restrictions were suffocating. Non-Muslims could not build new churches or synagogues, ring bells, or hold public religious processions. They could not testify against Muslims in court, carry weapons, or ride horses, symbols of status and dignity. These laws created a society of two tiers, Muslims at the top with full rights, and non-Muslims as permanent second-class subjects. Life under such conditions was not sustainable for most communities. Over time, the cumulative weight of taxes, legal disabilities, and the destruction of cultural symbols forced countless families to abandon their ancestral faiths. The devastation was not only material, but psychological. Communities lived under the constant reminder that their traditions were fragile, their identities under siege. Children grew up in a world where their places of worship lay in ruins, where their parents struggled under taxes designed to humiliate, and where their very existence was tolerated only under suffocating restrictions. The combination of economic pressure, cultural destruction, and relentless propaganda created a system of domination that went far beyond military conquest. It was conquest of the soul, conquest of memory, conquest of possibility. In North Africa, where Christian communities had once thrived and produced some of the greatest theologians in early Christianity, including Augustine of Hippo, an entire tradition was extinguished. The region that had once been a bastion of Christian thought, shaping doctrines that influenced the faith for centuries, lost its voice completely. By the medieval period, these communities had vanished, absorbed or erased under the weight of conquest, taxation, and persecution. In Persia, the ancient Zoroastrian faith suffered a similar fate. Once numbering in the millions, its adherents dwindled over the centuries until today they number fewer than 200,000 worldwide. A religion that had dominated the Persian Empire for over a millennium was reduced to scattered remnants, its temples destroyed, its priests silenced, its sacred texts burned. Entire spiritual worlds rooted in millennia of history were torn from their homelands and replaced with silence. The same machinery that dismantled religions also institutionalized sexual slavery on a scale unparalleled in history. The harem system, romanticized in later Orientalist art and literature, was in reality a carefully constructed system of control and exploitation. It was not merely about the pleasures of rulers or the indulgences of royal courts. It was about domination, about breaking conquered peoples by targeting their women, the carriers of culture and the heart of Afo. Family life. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, celebrated in folklore and immortalized in the tales of the Arabian Nights, presided over one of the largest harems in recorded history. Contemporary accounts suggest he maintained over 2,000 women in his private household, captives from across the empire, reduced to sexual property. When Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258, the last Abbasid Caliph's harem still contained over 700 women. As the city burned, chronicles describe the systematic rape and massacre of these women, their lives extinguished along with the empire they had been forced to serve. Centuries of institutionalized sexual slavery in the Abbasid capital ended not with liberation, but with blood. Concubinage was given a clear legal framework. Female slaves were regarded as property, with no rights of their own. They could be bought, sold, or gifted at will. Their children, unless explicitly acknowledged by the father, were deemed illegitimate and denied inheritance rights. This created a system where women were not only sexual commodities, but also disposable, constantly replaced as they aged or lost favor. Slave markets across the Islamic world specialized in the trade of women for sexual purposes. Ibn Battuta's travel writings describe markets in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad where women were displayed naked for potential buyers to examine their bodies. The most desirable could sell for prices equivalent to several years of wages for a skilled worker, reducing human lives to mere luxury items in the economy of desire. The psychological devastation on families was incalculable. Parents lived with the constant fear that their daughters might be seized and sold into sexual slavery. Some resorted to desperate measures, deliberately scarring their daughters' faces in hopes of making them less appealing to raiders or locking them indoors to keep them hidden from slave traders. Over time, these desperate acts helped to cement a culture of female seclusion in some regions, a practice born not of religious devotion but of sheer survival against the threat of enslavement. Because concubines were frequently discarded and replaced, the system demanded a constant influx of new captives. Unlike wives, who retained their position for life, concubines were subject to the whims of their owners. This meant that raids and wars often targeted young women specifically, devastating the demographic fabric of entire communities. Villages were emptied of their daughters, and with them, the possibility of stable families, cultural continuity, and generational survival. The scale of this trade was immense. In the Ottoman Empire alone, historians estimate that between the 14th and 19th centuries, over 1.5 million women were enslaved for sexual purposes. These women came from across the empire's vast frontiers, the Balkans, the Caucasus, Africa, and Central Asia, representing dozens of cultures and ethnic groups. Each captive was a thread torn from the tapestry of her people, woven instead into the machinery of another civilization's dominance. Islamic law provided the religious scaffolding for these practices. The Quranic phrase, "those whom your right hand possesses," was interpreted as divine permission for unlimited sexual access to female slaves. Religious scholars built entire bodies of jurisprudence regulating the purchase, ownership, and use of concubines, all while insisting that the system was sanctioned by God. The combination of legal codes and religious justification made the practice unassailable within the society that depended on it. For the conquered, the consequences went far beyond the individual suffering of enslaved women. The systematic removal of young women shattered family formation and disrupted the transmissio of culture from one generation to the next. Communities without daughters could not rebuild. Families without mothers could not pass on traditions. The demographic and cultural damage of centuries of sexual slavery left scars so deep that many societies never fully recovered. Just as the harems exploited the bodies of women, the economic systems of the caliphates exploited the lands and labor of conquered peoples with ruthless precision. Economic warfare was perfected as a tool not only of enrichment but of control. The goal was not simply to extract wealth but to weaken subject populations to the point of dependency. By imposing crushing taxes, rulers ensured that conquered peoples could not rise again. The kharaj, or land tax, often consumed half to 4/5 of all agricultural output. Farmers were left with just enough to survive, if that. Failure to pay meant confiscation, with land seized and redistributed to Muslim settlers or converted into waqf property, religious endowments that permanently removed resources from the reach of the conquered. The system was designed to hollow out communities, stripping them of both wealth and the capacity to rebuild. The conquest of Persia offers a clear example of this calculated destruction. The Sasanian Empire had developed some of the most sophisticated irrigation systems in the ancient world, sustaining vast agricultural networks across arid lands. After the Umayyad conquest, these systems were neglected, dismantled, or deliberately destroyed. Canals fell into disrepair, fields dried out, and regions that had once supported thriving populations were reduced to barren wastelands. This was not merely carelessness, it was policy, a deliberate dismantling of the infrastructure that had sustained Persian civilization for centuries. In this way, Islamic conquest worked on multiple levels at once. Armies broke cities, laws broke families, taxes broke economies, and harems broke spirits. It was not a single act of domination but a coordinated system of conquest, designed not just to win battles but to erase entire ways of life. It was not accidental mismanagement that led to the ruin of conquered lands, but a calculated strategy meant to cripple economic independence and secure absolute dependence on the new rulers. Tribute was often extracted not only in crops, wealth, and manufactured goods, but also in human lives. Entire communities were forced to surrender their people as part of the annual dues owed to the caliphate. The Nubians, for example, were compelled to send 400 slaves each year to the Fatimid rulers of Egypt. The Bulgars were ordered to hand over their young men for military service, effectively draining their populations of future workers and defenders. These demands hollowed out societies, leaving behind weakened and traumatized communities, while simultaneously supplying the Islamic world with a steady stream of forced labor. Beyond tribute, strict trade restrictions created a form of economic segregation that guaranteed non-Muslims would remain in a permanent state of disadvantage. Certain professions were closed to them, others were taxed so heavily that they became unprofitable, and laws tilted the playing field toward Muslim merchants. Over time, wealth was funneled upward into the hands of those connected to the ruling class, while Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, and Hindu communities saw their fortunes collapse. Towns that had once been prosperous centers of commerce slowly decayed, reduced to shadows of their former selves. This economic strangulation made rebellion nearly impossible. There was no surplus wealth to fund resistance, and it simultaneously encouraged conversion as the only path to survival and social mobility. But the project of domination did not end with controlling land and wealth. It extended into the very fabric of identity. The caliphates did not simply conquer territories. They dismantled entire cultures until almost nothing remained. This deliberate erasure was a form of cultural annihilation that reshaped the memory of civilizations. The destruction of libraries and archives was not an unfortunate byproduct of war but a recurring pattern. When Alexandria fell, what remained of its legendary library, the jewel of ancient scholarship, was consigned to flames. In Persia, the royal city of Ctesiphon saw its libraries and treasuries of knowledge destroyed, erasing centuries of literary and philosophical achievement. These acts severed the link between generations, leaving conquered peoples unable to access the intellectual heritage that had once defined them. Language itself was turned into a weapon. Arabic was imposed as the language of law, administration, and religious life, steadily crowding out local tongues. Over time, entire languages that had survived for thousands of years disappeared. The Coptic language, once spoken by the descendants of the pharaohs, was confined to church rituals before vanishing from everyday speech. Ancient Persian dialects were gradually silenced as Arabic took their place. Even geographical names were altered. Cities, rivers, and regions that had carried their original titles for millennia were renamed in Arabic, burying their past beneath new identities. This was more than bureaucracy. It was a rewriting of history itself. The suppression of cultural practices and traditions followed the same logic. Festivals that had bound communities together for centuries were outlawed or stigmatized. The joyous Persian celebration of Nowruz was banned in many regions, stripped of its meaning and nearly lost. In India, countless Hindu festivals were pressed under accusations of being un-Islamic. Customs that had been central to the rhythm of daily life were erased, leaving people unmoored from their heritage. Even the built environment was not spared. Temples, statues, palaces, and other monuments that testified to pre-Islamic civilizations were either destroyed or repurposed into mosques. The symbolic message was unmistakable. The past had no value, only the culture of the conquerors was legitimate. Education, too, was reshaped into a tool of control. Local schools that had once taught philosophy, literature, astronomy, medicine, and history were either closed or absorbed into religious institutions that emphasized only Islamic studies. Generations grew up disconnected from the intellectual traditions of their ancestors. What had once been rich and diverse cultural legacies collapsed into uniformity as conquered peoples forgot their own histories and learned to see the world through the lens imposed upon them. The consequences were profound. Egypt, whose civilization had survived Greek, Persian, and Roman occupations while retaining its unique identity, was completely transformed within a few centuries of Arab conquest. Its language, literature, religion, and traditions were extinguished, leaving little more than fragments preserved in archaeology and faint echoes in folk practices. Persia, once home to Zoroastrianism, epic poetry, and philosophical schools, was reduced to a cultural shadow of itself, struggling merely to survive on the margins. Entire civilizations that had withstood centuries of outside influence were erased in a matter of generations under the weight of systematic cultural destruction. What makes this process even more striking is its totality. Archaeologists continue to uncover traces of lost worlds buried beneath the surface, revealing evidence of advanced societies whose very memory had been wiped out. Inscriptions, ruins, and broken artifacts speak to what once existed, but these fragments are all that remain. The written records are gone, the oral traditions silenced, the continuity of culture shattered. It is as if enormous chapters of human history were torn out of the book of memory, leaving blank pages where vibrant civilizations had once thrived. The machinery of the caliphates was one of the most efficient systems of conquest and domination the world has ever seen. It combined military campaigns, economic exploitation, cultural erasure, and institutionalized slavery into a seamless mechanism designed to ensure that no conquered people could resist or recover. The scope of destruction was unprecedented. Millions were enslaved, countless others killed, and generations forced to abandon their faiths, languages, and traditions. Entire peoples disappeared, not through sudden extermination, but through slow, deliberate absorption into an imposed cultural framework. These were not random outbursts of cruelty or misunderstandings between cultures. They were carefully crafted strategies aimed at breaking the will of entire populations. By stripping away wealth, dismantling identities, and removing cultural continuity, the caliphates ensured that resistance was crushed not only physically, but spiritually. Conquered peoples were left without resources, without leaders, and without a memory of who they once were. The legacy of these actions reaches beyond the past. Understanding the calculated nature of these practices helps illuminate similar patterns that still echo in modern forms of cultural suppression and domination. The tools may have changed, libraries replaced by digital archives, festivals restricted by political decrees, languages eroded by mass media, but the underlying goal remains familiar: the elimination of alternative ways of life and the imposition of a singular cultural order. History shows us that this process was devastating and in many cases irreversible. Civilizations that vanished under Islamic expansion are gone forever, their voices silenced, their knowledge lost. What remains are ruins, fragments, and faint memories carried forward in whispers of tradition. To recognize this history is not only to understand the past, but to grasp how fragile cultural survival can be when faced with deliberate erasure